feel like I'm exposing darkness every time I speak about it. My grandmother invited possibly the devil himself into her home and brought a curse onto all of the females in our family after her. I've always wondered if this is the reason for all of the misfortune in my life, or why every home I've lived in has followed something. Let me start from the beginning of the story. All of what I'm about to tell are accounts of my mother and the daughters of my great grandmother, which are my grandmother, my mom's mom, and her sister, my great auntie. For as long as my grandma and aunt could remember, my great grandma had a crystal ball, a Ouija board, and a pendulum all on her table. She was a witch. She would hold seances, and pregnant women would come to her to determine the sex of their babies. Over 100 pregnant women came to her for this service. Out of those 100, she was never wrong. They all had what she said they would. She charged $2 for this. The year is 1967. My grandmother was 14 and my great auntie was 13. They were wild girls who liked to go out with boys, skip school, and come home late after partying. Throughout the years, my great aunt, who was the main target of my great grandmother's mischief, experienced several strange phenomena linked to my great grandmother, from a white veil coming down from the sky and almost suffocating her, after great grandma found out she lost her virginity, to a black coffin appearing on my great grandmother's porch, when my great grandmother got mad at my aunt for not answering the phone for her. There's so many other strange things, but those were very odd and unexplainable. However, none of these small accounts would compare to the night when my great grandmother went from doing a little magic to full on inviting darkness itself into her home. One summer night in 1967, my grandmother and great aunt came home around 2 a.m., drunk and loudly giggling and stumbling into the home. When coming in, my great grandmother was sitting in her den waiting for them. She was furious, but they laughed and told her to just go back to bed and to get over it. Outraged and feeling like she had no other way of controlling her daughters, she fell to her knees and began praying out loud to the devil himself, for him to teach her daughters a lesson and make them behave. They didn't take her seriously, mocking her as they stumbled to the bedroom they shared and began changing into their nightdresses and getting into their side-by-side beds. Quickly falling asleep, 3 a.m. approached. About an hour went by. My great aunt began hearing my great grandmother's brother, who lived with them, coming down the hall, which was odd, because his bedroom was on the other side of the house, and there was no reason for him to be in the hallway. She knew it was him because he suffered from a stroke and one of his legs dragged behind him. So she heard him coming a footstep and a drag over and over, until it was outside their open bedroom door. Laying on her side, with her back to the door, she called out, "Tio, what's wrong? Do you need something?" No response. As she tries to turn around and sit up, she realizes she can't move. A sense of pure evil filled the pitch-black room. Panicking now, she suffers for over 30 minutes, paralyzed as she feels someone standing right behind her, fully knowing this wasn't her Tio, it was something malicious. She began to feel her cover slowly pull off her body, and her nightgown began to be pulled up, stopping at her shoulders. A quick slap to her back and an imminent burning pain. She jolted to life and was able to move again, bursting into tears as she jumped out of bed. My great aunt, now in hysterics, starts trying to wake my sleeping grandma next to her. She awakes and instantly starts freaking out and uncontrollably crying as well. The whole time this was happening to my great aunt, my grandmother was having a dream that she died and went to hell. In a dream, which was only about an hour. She spent years in hell suffering. They held each other tightly, but my great aunt's back was hurting her so badly. After telling her sister of her experience, she shows her back to my grandma, and on her back was a burn in the shape of a goat hoof, with 3 distinct finger-like marks. As if they couldn't be more traumatized by the experiences they both had, that mark was all the validation that this was real. Calming down now, My great-grandmother all of a sudden is at their bedroom door, startling them with a loud, menacing laugh. She then said the craziest thing. She said, "Oh, my poor girls, did something scare you?" After that day, the house never felt the same. Even if you had all the windows open or all the lights on, it felt dark. Doors would slam, locks would flick back and forth, kitchen drawers would open, and silverware would fly out. Even late at night, the piano would play by itself. The house began to rot and fall apart. It stayed in the family until recently, when my great aunt, who inherited the house after my great grandmother passed away, fixed it up and sold it to someone unknowing of all this. My great aunt didn't want to own the house, much less live in it, knowing what these were, and that the events that took place. I mean, how could she forget? She has a hoof-shaped scar on her back to this very day. You see, it should have ended with my great aunt and my grandmother, but when she prayed to whatever it was that answered her, she asked for it to teach her daughters a lesson. That means every daughter in our family after her is included. We've all had terrible relationships with our mothers, and unexplainable things happen to us, from bad luck to paranormal activity. So if you move to the center of New Mexico, be careful, because you might be moving into a home with an over 40-year-old curse and a portal. My hometown of Santa Fe, New Mexico is extremely haunted. Being the oldest capital city in the United States, lots of terrible things have happened on the ground that hundreds of thousands of tourists walk on each year. The ground is soaked with the blood of the natives who lived here when the Spanish conquered the land. This is the first of many stories about my hometown I'm going to post. The oldest cemetery in the city has graves that go back to before the 1800s. People who are said to haunt certain buildings are buried there. It just so happens that the cemetery's address is 1134. 1134 spells hell if you flip it. The front of the cemetery is gated, but the original iron gate doesn't run the perimeter. The back of the cemetery has no fence. Many here say that's because the graves go farther past where the marked graves end. Directly behind the cemetery is a power transformer that's so big you can hear the hum from the front of the cemetery. You see where I'm going with this? Spirits feed off electricity in order to manifest, etc. A lot of people who live here don't even know that behind the cemetery is a little forest in the middle of town, successfully hidden by building homes and a huge academy around it. This wood is called Devil's Grove. The trees, however, are odd. Many of them have holes in the middle that go farther down than where the trunk meets the ground. There's no fencing or anything. The wood is hidden in plain sight. The people who live in the homes surrounding it do not venture there. I've tried finding the article on Google, but had no luck, so I've had to go to the library to look through the archives. However, in the late 80s, a boy who lived in the area went missing. His mother said he'd gone to play in the river runoff that ran through the woods and behind the homes. They searched and searched, and they found him in the woods. He was head first up to his waist in one of the tree holes. He was obviously dead already. See, the holes aren't big enough to fit your body into, even if you were a small boy. The tree had dug into his stomach and back. There's no way he would have been able to get himself into the hole. It said the tree looked like it swallowed him. So fast forward to 1991. My dad was in his late teens and was a gang member. He had a terrible home life and turned to the streets. He and his friends decided to rob a gas station up the street from the cemetery. It went bad, and the cops were called. He ran and cut through the cemetery and went to hide in the trees. Of course, he'd heard the stories of Devil's Grove, but my dad was a superstitious man his whole life. So, he didn't think anything as he lay down among the trees to hide from the cops. They came through and passed him going farther, eventually making their way out back to the street. When it went silent about an hour later, he got up to pee. He walked a couple of feet so he wouldn't be peeing by his bed for the night. As he was peeing on one of the trees, he noticed it had a hole. Finishing, he He looked around and picked up a handful of rocks. He held the rock up as high as the hole and dropped it to the ground. Hitting the ground, it made a noticeable thud. So, he dropped the first decent-sized rock down the hole. However, he never heard the rock hit the ground. He dropped another and another, but he never heard anything hit solid ground. Unnerved, he went back to his spot and laid back down. The later it got, the more the area came to life. He heard footsteps several times along, with leaves cracking and twigs snapping, but there was no one there. The cops had flashlights and talked amongst themselves with their radios blaring static earlier in the night. So we knew the lone footsteps were not then. He stayed in the woods almost all night until he finally started to get scared. Looking up from the ground at the trees surrounding him, he felt unsafe. About 15 years later, after I was already a kid, we moved into the neighborhood behind the trees. The arroyo ran right outside my bedroom window, so we were very close to the trees. And I'll tell you that I was never allowed to go even close to it or the trees. I eventually explored the trees and the cemetery as a teen. I saw figures, I heard many unexplainable noises, and the activity was definitely more intense near the transformer. Hopefully I can go to search the archives to see if I can find the news article of the boy. But anyways, that's the story of Devil's Grove. The other day, the local paper did a report on one of the places on my list, so I took it as a sign. I was originally hesitant to tell this story, as they recently rebranded this place, and I was a little scared of being sued. I didn't know if this hotel was trying to keep the past hidden, but since they've recently spoken up about the history themselves, I figured it's fair game. The Drury Inn is a fairly new hotel to the downtown area. They only opened in the last 10 or so years. However, the building that is now the Drury Inn has been there for quite some time. This hotel used to be the original St. Vincent Hospital, being the only hospital in Santa Fe for a very long time. The old hospital has more than its fair share of horror stories and resident ghosts. So the fact that it's now a luxury hotel is mind-boggling to me. I'll be honest, I personally would never lay my head there, even if I did have the money. Where to begin? I guess I'll tell the more mild of the two, most well-known events at the hospital. During a late winter night, a young and fairly new nurse was working in the third-floor nurse station. Going about her duties, she heard a child crying coming from down the hall from where she was. She walked the hall till she was standing in front of room 311. This is where the crying was coming from. When she opened the door to see, the crying stopped. No one was set up in this room at the time, so of course she was very confused. She thought maybe she misheard where it was coming from, so she went around and checked the other rooms, yet every patient was in fact asleep. As she went back to the nurse station from behind her, she heard once again the painful crying of a young child. She swiftly walked back to room 311, where she got the door, she flung it open and flipped on the lights. But of course the crying stopped once more. She even went as far to check under the bed, but yet again nothing. Trying to calm herself, she went back to the nurse station to sit down. For a little while, it was silent until the crying began again. Imagine how she felt, being a nurse, a person who genuinely wants to help people, and hearing a helpless baby crying in pain, yet you cannot help. So again, she walked to 311, and yet again the crying stopped as soon as she opened the door. The next night she came in to work her shift, and caught a couple of fellow nurses before they left. She told them about her eventful night, and their faces changed. They told her that everyone who worked the night shift on the third floor heard the crying, and it picked up in the winter, especially around Christmas time. They told her to just ignore it. And for a little while, she didn't even hear the crying until Christmas Eve. She knew from the beginning that it was a baby, as she had worked with babies in the hospital before, and to her, the cry a baby makes when it's in pain was unlike anything else, and unfortunately, was burned into her memory. So for a while, she listened to the crying, And that's when the cry turned into the sound of the baby gasping for air. It was a sound she also knew, the sound of a baby taking its last breaths. A week later, she mentioned the event to some co-workers as they had dinner. One of the other nurses at the table told us she had been on duty on the third floor on Christmas Eve a few years prior. She said there was a bad car accident on the highway. In one of the cars was a father and his infant little boy. The dad died at the scene and they rushed the baby to the hospital, which, may I add, is quite a long drive from the highway where the crash had taken place. Apparently, the little boy was suffering from internal bleeding. It was only a couple hours later when the poor angel succumbed to his injuries. The nurse said she still remembered hearing the little boy take his last breaths, but they were rough and deep. The fairly new nurse asked her which room the baby had died in, and of course, it was room 311. I wonder if the Drury Inn rents 311 out during the holidays. I mean, it seems to already be occupied. This is a truly heartbreaking tale of the old building that I can imagine holds many like this. However, on the other side of the spectrum, the building holds something much darker. Every haunted place has its hotspot. For the old St. Vincent Hospital, that spot is the basement. People have reported experiencing many things in the basement. Disembodied voices and screams, things being banged on and crashing, seeing shadow people, and not only being touched but yanked, pushed, and pulled by their clothes and hair. This could be your normal run-of-the-mill haunting, right? However, people have also reported hearing low, guttural growls, moaning, being scratched, and probably most scary is more than a couple of people have reported seeing blood dripping down the walls. Many will tell you there's no ghost in the basement, rather a demonic presence. They naturally used the space for storage, so staff didn't venture down there often. It's safe to say that every time someone went down there, they experienced something. At one point, when it wasn't a public hospital anymore, it was used as a nursing home. I don't know what made the nursing home staff less cautious than the hospital staff, but they took the rumours of the basements as an opportunity of sorts to scare each other. Anytime they had a new hire, they'd wait till nightfall and take the newbie down the service elevator to the basement. It was almost like a hazing ritual. They'd take them down, and when they'd reach the basement, they'd make the new nurse get out. They'd leave them with no flashlight in the dark, unfamiliar place, and tell them to find the staircase and meet them back on the third floor. The lights in the basement didn't work at all for some reason or another, and the only light source that would be down there would be an exit sign. On top of that, the basement had been described as a maze-like. One night, after training a new nurse's aide, one of the other nurses was given the responsibility of escorting the new nurse down the elevator to the basement so she could complete her initiation. They reached the bottom and wished the girl good luck, and reminded her to meet them back at the third floor. She went back to the third floor nurse's station to wait for her. After about an hour, she started to wonder where she was. Even if she got lost, she should have already been able to find her way and make it back up. So she decided to go find her. However, she was scared to go alone, so she convinced another nurse's aide to go with her. When reaching the bottom, she got out to look for her, while the nurse's aides kept the elevator doors open to shed some light, although it didn't help much. Luckily, she did have a flashlight. She started searching rooms and then calling for the girl's name, when she heard a very quiet reply off in the distance. She yelled out to the side that she thinks she found her, and to wait for them. She went in the direction she heard her, and found the poor girl balled up in the corner of a big dusty room, quivering in fear behind an old filing cabinet. She helped the girl up and began leaving the room when she noticed something strange on the wall of the room. It was some kind of liquid. She ran her fingers down the wall to further examine the strange substance. It covered her fingers. Having nothing to wipe it off with and wearing her white uniform, she left it to dry on her hands. When they reached the elevator, she looked down to find her fingers were covered in what appeared to be blood. And when she smelled it, it was the unmistakable iron smell. That's when she began panicking, not wanting to be on that floor another second. They all stayed frightful long after they made it back up to the station. After the new aide calmed down enough, she told them what happened to her. She had begun trying to find the stairs, but kept bumping into things as it was so dark. She started hearing things behind her that sounded like small taps and then thuds. That's when she heard the growls coming from seemingly right behind her head. She took off running until she landed in her little spot where they found her. Later that night, the maintenance man overheard them talking about the experience and chimed in. Apparently, he had been the maintenance man there for a while, even back when it was still a hospital. He said the hospital staff used to use the furnace in the basement to cremate organs removed in surgery, and even amputated limbs. I believe that all the energy the staff put into being scared of the basement only intensified the activity down there. Supposedly after this happened, the nursing home staff never carried out another initiation. Not too long after the nursing home shut down, and the building was left vacant for some time. In my teens, it was covered in graffiti and had many busted out windows. It was well known among my age group that teens would break into the building to party, explore, and probably see if they'd experienced anything paranormal. A couple times, my friends and I would sit outside the building on the steps and attempt to hold spirit box sessions, and we captured words like hospital, died, pain, meds, and help. A couple times, I swear I had seen figures in the windows next to the huge double-door entrance. Now you do understand how crazy it is to me that this is the very building that is now a luxury hotel, and also why I wasn't surprised reading the article in the paper that detailed a family staying there and being messed with all night long by an unseen force. Maybe if they'd done some research, but then again, I look at the building now, and there's honestly no resemblance to the once booming hospital, and a simple Google search on its current name won't spark much suspicion. Only when digging deeper with the original name will you uncover the past. Lucky you guys have me, so you won't have any surprises if you decide to book a room there. Here, there are a few nameless ghosts with no backstory or origin. This is a very sad, tragic story, and also happens to be one of my personal favourites. La Posada is a very beautiful and very old resort and spa. They offer lots of services for the folks who might be a little heavier in the pockets. There's one, however, who stays here without paying a cent. I mean, she is the lady of the house after all. Abraham Staub was an ambitious young man from Germany. His brother Zadok and himself decided to come to Santa Fe, New Mexico, to start a trading business in 1854. They were successful in their endeavors and accumulated a large fortune. About 10 years later, in 1865, Abraham returned to Germany for one thing. Julia Schuster was a young, beautiful, and refined German girl, and she was to be Abraham's bride. They were married in Germany. After celebrating their nuptials and getting some affairs in order, they travelled back to Santa Fe, so Abraham could not only continue his business, but so that they could start their new luxurious life. When arriving, Abraham showed his love for his young bride by building her a grand French Second Empire mansion beyond her wildest dreams. It was one of the biggest homes in Santa Fe at the time, and they spent no time at all filling it with children and guests, as Julia rapidly became a prominent socialite and a mother of 7. Their stature made them well-respected people in society and led to Abraham becoming the first president of the Chamber of Commerce. If the story ended here, it would be a happily ever after story. However, the Staub's good fortune and happy life would shatter, although it might not have been as happy-go-lucky as it seemed. Behind the huge parties and well-respected image is rumoured to be abuse and neglect. Some say Abraham wasn't a very good husband, like many men of the time. To them, a woman was property, and striking their wives wasn't something they hesitated to do. Not too long after Julia had her 8th child, the infant died. Julia became extremely depressed, and the depression only worsened when she suffered from several miscarriages. It said her hair rapidly and prematurely turned white, and her mind was slipping fast. She apparently retired to her boudoir for the remainder of her short life and completely lost her mind. In 1896, at the age of 52, Julia couldn't take her suffering anymore and took her own life. Years later, in 1913, Abraham died as well. The Staub mansion continued to be filled with guests as they built around the mansion and turned the entire estate into what was and still is La Posada Resort and Spa. Booked to full capacity year-round as one of the most popular places to stay in town, its history hasn't affected the flow of people staying there. I mean, Julia doesn't run guests off. However, it's said she sometimes runs off employees. I know several people who have in fact worked at La Posada, my father being one of them, and they've all told me the same story. When being hired in any position at the La Posada, your training manager gives you a rose. They proceed to take you up to the second floor of the main house, to Julia's boudoir, where you're to leave the rose on her windowsill and introduce yourself to Julia. It's said if this is not done, she'll make you quit in one way or another, taking the lack of introduction and gift as a sign of disrespect. Yes, the manager can hire you, but Julia is the only one who really decides if you stay. Of course, the help must show the lady of the house the utmost respect. That hasn't changed since Julia was alive. My dad was hired as a server in the restaurant many years ago. He had a couple of strange things happen while he worked there. One night, the bar was buzzing with the sound of patrons drinking, dining, and being social. There was a man sitting at the bar who was acting belligerent. The bartender was a woman who worked there for some time, and I imagine Julia took a liking to her, maybe was even protective of her. The man was being very disrespectful to a bartender, when all of a sudden his glass flew off the bar behind him. Many people witnessed the glass of something or another be thrown, all of them in shock. Another time, my dad was working the late shift. He was doing his side work and getting his area ready for tomorrow. The bar was empty, as it was closing time. When he saw her, she was standing on the stairs in her red dress. The red dress is what she's usually seen wearing. Just standing there looking over the railing, and as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. I'm sure to this day, people hear her singing lullabies to her lost child, or see her walking the corridors of her beloved home. And perhaps she's still putting people who deserve it in their place. So if you come to Santa Fe and decide to stay at the resort and get a massage, be respectful and keep an eye out for the red dress. This happened a few years ago now, but I think about it a lot, and I've wanted to share it in a place I won't get judged. A friend, my stepdad, and I visited an old asylum grounds on one night while we were in the area. It was from the time of lobotomies and other kinds of inhumane acts on the mentally ill. My mum is a very, very spiritual person, and having been there once before, refused to go again because of how badly it feels around there. Something evil happened in the cannery, she reminded my stepdad. I don't want you going in there with them. The grounds had many areas. The main building was repurposed for some sort of military thing, so that was off limits. But the farms, cannery, and other small buildings weren't being used. The first thing I remember when we rolled up was the feeling. It felt just awful. You could tell awful things happened here. We only ended up walking through the barn areas. A corn silo and 2 barns were in the area. I remember walking through one of the barns and seeing how they tried to cover up cages under wood planks for livestock to stand on. Those cages weren't just for livestock, my stepdad said. The second barn had a milking room attached to it. There was a fire, you could tell. Black all up the walls and floor. I just kept feeling more and more awful, but wanting to listen to my surroundings as much as I could. And then it happened. Now, I'm skeptical about the idea of ghosts the way the media describes them. However, I do believe that if something so strong happens somewhere, it will imprint on the earth around it, be it good or bad. The earth remembers. I saw, or maybe it would be better to say I felt, a little girl. And here are things I felt about her. She loved the cows. They were her favourite. No matter what was happening to her, she was allowed to see the cows, and that's all she wanted. In my mind's eye, I saw her run past me, and I heard her laugh. She had black hair, and I could have sworn there was a cat with her too. It was like a scene in a movie where someone had a flashback, and it felt almost like the earth was sharing its memory with me. And then she was gone, and I was left staring at the falling apart barn. I cried on the way home. Even through all the terrible things, that girl still enjoyed her life. And I hope in the next one, I can see her again. For context, I'm Hispanic in a Hispanic family, and so that comes with superstitions and spiritual shit. So you can imagine the vibes. My parents are divorced, and my mom has a habit of constantly moving. This story was told to me during one of the moves. My mom was out of town, so me and my older brother were left to clean up the house and pack up and stuff. As we were packing, we found an old cassette player. He picked it up and had a cold blank stare. Basically, he told me that when we were living in one of the previous houses, he found a cassette player like this one in one of the many boxes under the stairs. He said my mom used to record our conversations and use them in court against my dad. Yeah, she's crazy like that, but that's another story. He said one day when he was alone in my mom's house, he grabbed the cassette player box thing and hit play, and he heard a woman's eerie voice singing. He can't quite remember what she was singing. He said he understood it, but it wasn't quite English or Spanish. It was like a weird language that for some reason he could understand, but not replicate. And it was 100% not my mom. It was a different voice completely, older and more raspy. He told me he felt like a heavy weight in his chest, so he put it away and hid in his room until someone came home. Now here's the freaky part. Mind you, my older brother is the smarty pants of the family. He's the stereotypical, logical and technical to a fault kid of the family. He isn't as religious, if at all, as my parents, or as superstitious as me. He wouldn't make something like this up. I know he wouldn't. Years later, he had forgotten about the whole thing, and we were living with my dad in an apartment. He said my dad, my oldest brother, and I had gone to Costco or some shit, and he was home alone. Then the phone rang. The house phone. He went to pick it up, and it was that same voice. That same raspy, eerie, heart-wrenching voice just singing. He said he froze to his core in shock, and he told me that his eyes began to water. It's so bizarre. I tried to brainstorm and rationalize an explanation, but he said he didn't even want to talk about it. Like, logically speaking, if it were a person, they would have had to have known he heard the tape and known where we moved. I think it's important to note it was not my mom's voice. He assured me it wasn't my mom's voice. Freaky shit. My girlfriend and I recently moved into a house. We had been living in an apartment for as long as we were dating. This was our first house. We were incredibly lucky to get a house, her being only 23 and me being 26. My great uncle had passed away, and my aunt offered to help us purchase his house. We were living in a bad part of town, and she wanted us to have a safe place. We have several pets, and I recently got a dog. I was sitting on the couch in the living room, my girlfriend was at work, and I had stayed home due to a migraine. As I sat there, I heard what sounded like small footsteps, and the cabinets in the kitchen opening and closing. I figured it was Thor, our fat as hell silvery tabby who tries his hardest to get food. But when I looked up, all of the cats were in the bay window. I didn't have a dog at the time. It was a little eerie, but I wasn't really scared, more confused and curious. Then, my girlfriend and I were sitting together and playing games. The same thing happened. Me and her looked at each other and my girlfriend just goes, "Frederick!" She goes into the kitchen and pulls a gnome statue from under the sink. She moved the statue out of the office where he has a good view of outside and put a plant inside his little trough. We haven't had a weird incident since Frederick has been out there. I'm convinced we have a house fairy, or the gnome is just a secretly cursed object. Growing up, my girlfriend lived in 2 haunted houses. I think paranormal things are just attracted to her family. She has Native American in her blood, and they're very spiritual. Her sister is able to see things. She once saw us hunched over a dark shadow in the hallway of her house. She said it looked like a shadow Quasimodo. She also used to have this circular mass shadow that would come out of her closet and go across the wall to her rat's cage, where she would scream bloody murder, like something was attacking him. She would tell it to go away, and it did. Their mother had powers of premonition when it came to people having children. She would always dream about the gender of the child before they were born, and it would be 100% accurate each time. She also got the house she wanted because she felt as though the previous owner, who had passed away, wanted her to have the house. My girlfriend has had many strange things happen while meditating, like her onyx crystal cracking on the inside. I myself used to experience this thing my parents and I call the peoples when I lived with them. I believe it was residual energy. When you were laying in the house towards the back, you could vaguely hear the sound of people talking. You could never quite understand what was being said, and occasionally old tunes would echo as well. The activity at our new house has picked up a little. The other day, I was soaking in the bath. I'm a water gremlin and love taking warm baths and just relaxing. My cat, Christina, always has to be in the bathroom with me. She's a black and white cat. My girlfriend was out on a walk and none of the other animals were nearby when this happened. I heard the click of the bathroom door being opened. I assumed it was my girlfriend and turned to look at the door, calling her name. The doorknob was slowly turning as the door eked open. No one answered. There was no one on the other side. I wasn't really scared for some reason. I was just curious and too tired to get up and shut the door. I definitely feel like the previous homeowner, Uncle Will, is still around, but it doesn't really bother me. I've never felt threatened, but I've always felt like there's another energy there. Another thing that happened was I was sitting on the couch watching The Naked Gun. My Shiba, Scooby, was chewing on this toy. He suddenly started glaring into the kitchen and snarling and barking. All the cats were in the living room with me, and nothing was where he was barking. Once again, I felt like I wasn't alone, but I didn't feel threatened. Often our cats stare at the ceiling like something is there, but they don't hiss or growl. They occasionally meow. I'd love to hear some of your stories. I've always loved the paranormal and believe what we still leave some part of ourselves behind. Tell me, what have you seen? On the day in question of my first paranormal experience, my family, my parents and my sister, had gone to another city almost 60 kilometers away to visit my aunt and uncle, leaving me alone at home. My parents went out in the afternoon and came back the next day at night. The night of their departure, I was sleeping, and as I turned over, I half opened my eyes and saw clearly as daylight a dark shadow in human form with 2 red orbs for eyes across the room looking at me. I didn't give it any importance until the next day when I remembered it and went back to sleep. My room overlooked the inner courtyard of the building we lived in, and being winter, the blinds were all the way down to keep out the cold, so it couldn't have been the outside lights. To this day, the memory of that shadow continues to haunt me, as I haven't found any explanation for what I saw, even though I tried to recreate it without success. My little sister has commented to me on dozens of occasions, seeing how a dark thing as night peeks into her room through the doorframe and moves away when she sees it. A few months ago, I would go back in after smoking a cigarette, and the whole living room was dark. At that moment, I saw a kind of mist with the height of a human pass through the room and disappear through the exit door. Several minutes later, my mother told me that she had seen the same thing from the kitchen and would swear it was a woman. A couple of weeks ago, my father had gone to smoke in the backyard of our house, and when he went back inside and turned on the lights, he swore that he thought he saw for a few seconds what looked like a child. My sister had already been sleeping for several hours, standing in front of the kitchen door before disappearing. She almost dropped the glass of water he was carrying in her hand that night. What do you think, guys? A few days ago, I was going through family photos from my childhood with my mother when we came across of her grandfather. Then, a memory came to me in the form of a flashback of the day of his death. My family on my mother's side is very religious, and on Saturdays we went to church and then went to my great-grandparents' house to eat together. In the last months of my great-grandfather's life, he had a bone disease that prevented him from moving more than a few meters without pain. On the day of my great-grandfather's death, my mother's cousin and I were playing in my great-grandfather's room when my mother kicked us out to let him sleep. About 15 minutes later, we were playing in the yard when looking out a window of the house that was more than 20 meters from my great-grandmother's room. We clearly saw my great-grandfather standing and smiling as he greeted us. A few minutes later, my mother called to us to eat, and when she went to tell my great-grandfather, she found him dead. According to what my mother told me, the autopsy revealed that my great-grandfather had been dead for about 10 minutes when they found him. Knowing this, I seriously wondered if what I and my mother's cousin saw was the spirit of my great-grandfather saying goodbye. What do you think? This happened in the middle of June 2020. It was a very strange experience. I have yet to hear a reasonable explanation for what had happened that night. For some background, I have never believed in anything paranormal. My girlfriend claims to have had a couple paranormal experiences, but they seem too cliché to be legitimate. I live in Utah, and I'm not religious. However, a common hangout spot at night in Utah is the nearest church. My friend used to live in a neighborhood with a church in it. We'd hang out, eat food, and talk, etc. Right next to the church was an underground tunnel that was also a common trail people would walk. The road goes over the tunnel. The road above the tunnel is about 20 feet above the tunnel. The road is pretty much a bridge. So after we were done hanging out, I was driving back alone. As I cross over the bridge, I see a black and white cat fall off the bridge and into where the tunnel is. I only saw its butt, however I knew it was a cat. It's not uncommon to see stray cats at night in this neighborhood. I see them all the time. However, I was very confused why the cat would jump off of a 20-foot drop. I love all animals, and I've raised many stray kittens and baby birds, so I was contemplating pulling over and going to see if he's okay. I didn't at first, because my brother had recently gotten a new cat named Sylvester, after the Looney Tunes character, only a couple of days ago, and if I knew I found an injured cat, we'd rescue it and want to keep it. But I turned around anyway and parked next to the school by the tunnel to see if it was okay. The roads were barren. It was 1 a.m. in a quiet Utah religious neighborhood, so I wasn't nervous in any way. I just wanted to see if the cat was okay. I park and get out. There's a fairly steep hill leading down into the tunnel, so I make my way down. I turned on my phone flashlight to see if I could see any sign of an animal, and I couldn't. The tunnel was empty, but I couldn't see the other side of the tunnel. I walk down the tunnel to the very end and don't see anything. The tunnel is maybe only 30 feet long, and then it comes out onto the other side of the road. I walk back extremely confused, because the cat wouldn't just drop 20 feet down and be completely fine. Now this is the frightening part. As I'm walking back up the hill, I see an extremely bright light at the far end of the trail, and it's moving closer to me. I didn't know what it was. My first instinct was to run, but the light was getting closer, and I honestly wasn't scared because the neighborhood is primarily Mormon, and right next to a school I used to go to. So I wait to see what it is. As it gets closer, I hear bike wheels rolling and pedals turning. I didn't want to look weird, so I didn't run. I just kept walking back to my car. In my mind, I was trying to process why someone would be riding their bike at 1 a.m. It was a woman. She was maybe like 20 or 21. She was quite attractive, if I'm being honest. She was dressed in a floral print dress that looked like it came directly out of the 1960s. No shoes and long hair that fell across her cheeks. She says, "Hey," in a friendly voice. I responded with, "Hey, what's up?" or something like that. Everyone in Utah is really friendly and talkative, so I didn't really think anything of it, other than why the hell was she riding her bike this late? She said she was going home, and then replied with a question about what I'm doing. I said I was looking for a black and white cat I saw fall off the road because I was worried it got hurt. She responded with, "Oh no, I haven't seen a black and white cat around here, but I used to have a cat named Sylvester. He was so cool. He used to be able to open doors and stuff." My face felt like it got stung by a million bees and my heart dropped. Is this a fucking joke? Did she just say my new cat's name? I understand it's a common name for black and white cats, but why did I just see one fall off a road and encounter a very strange looking woman who also had a black and white cat named Sylvester that just happened to be my new cat's name? There's no way this is actually happening. I responded with, "Oh wow, really? That's so funny," or something along the lines of that. I tell her to have a good night after telling her to keep an eye out for the cat. She responds with, "Of course I will," and just keeps walking back to my car. I was kind of scared at this point, like actually. I get in my car and get on the phone to call my girlfriend. She doesn't answer, so I just give up and drive off. As I back out and drive to get onto the road, the woman isn't in sight. Genuinely, she's nowhere to be found. She should be easily spotted with the bright lights on her bike, but she's not. The trail was left dark and empty, as if she was never there. The woman was riding on the sidewalk. The trail splits off into two pathways. One goes into the tunnel, and one goes in the sidewalk that connects to the road. She was on the sidewalk. There's no way she could have gotten into the tunnel, because as I said, the hill down into the tunnel is fairly steep. There's no way she could have ridden or even walked down there with a bike. However, she was legitimately gone. Nowhere in sight. No lights, no bike, no sound, no nothing. Where did she go? So can anyone give me an explanation? Was it just some girl genuinely going home? Did she also have a cat named Sylvester? If so, how and why did she disappear? Also, why was she dressed like a 60s hippie? No shoes, floral dress, long ratty hair. I genuinely am stumped. I have no other option but to come back here and ask for an explanation. Do you guys think this was a ghost? Or just a very strange coincidence? In January of 2011, my childhood best friend passed away. Her name was Carla. We were super close growing up, and I would often sleep over at her house, and we'd rent movies from the shop around the corner. We sort of lost touch when I moved cities 400 miles away, but would still communicate. After she passed away, I remember I didn't have dreams for almost 2 weeks. Then, one of my closest friends told me about a dream they had. With her. Carla appeared to my friend in a dream. They had never met before, and asked my friend where I was. She was looking for me. Then, like clockwork, the following night, I had a dream with her. I was in her old neighborhood, and it was a bright-ass sunny day. I could barely see the cars and houses. Then, from around the corner, Carla comes walking towards me, and she's smiling. She doesn't say anything, but gives me a big hug. I don't remember what happened after, but I think I woke up shortly after. I forgot to mention that before the dream that night, I was watching a movie and eating in my room when my nightlight started flickering and eventually turned off. I thought, no big deal. I'll get a new bulb. After I woke up from the dream, my nightlight turned on. I don't know what this means, but I felt her there. Fast forward to this year. I read recently about how lost loved ones tend to visit us during special times like birthdays or anniversaries of death. We just have to see it, I guess. So I started talking to Carla more often than normal and thanking her for everything she's done for me, since her birthday was coming up. On March 1st, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I thought to grab my phone so I could listen to my podcasts. When I walked into the living room, I got a huge whiff of Carla's house. It was unmistakable. You know when certain people's homes just have a smell? Not necessarily bad, but just a certain scent. I smelled her. I couldn't believe it. I almost cried, but I acknowledged her presence and said thank you for visiting me. On the morning of March 3rd, her birthday, around 5 a.m., my boyfriend and I woke up to the sound of something small that fell, coming from the kitchen. He got up to investigate, thinking maybe our cats dropped something. He found out it was a little wall sign we have in the kitchen that says, "I love you more than bacon." It's been there for almost a year. This is a series of occurrences that lead me to believe I have a ghost cat in my apartment. First time was when I recently moved into the apartment. About a month later, I was getting ready for work in the morning when I noticed my cat playing with a shoelace in the hall. In the hall, there's a small closet. My cat was playing with the shoelace in front of the closet door when I saw something white swiping from under the door. Almost like a cat trying to get the shoelace from the other side. My cat saw it too, and she stopped what she was doing to stare at the bottom of the door. I immediately thought it was my other cat who has white paws, so I opened the door to check. Nothing. Second time was a few months later. My boyfriend and I were trying to fall asleep in bed around 11 p.m. when we heard tiny footsteps run and then jump onto our futon couch in the living room. Sounded small. Just like a cat randomly running and jumping on the couch. We both looked at each other because both our cats were in bed with us and our dog was crated at night. He said, "What was that?" I said, "I don't know." So we went to check, but saw nothing. Third time, we had a guest in our home. I usually leave a box or two out for my cats when I get a new package since they both love them. So I had one in the middle of our dining room. My friend, my boyfriend and I were in the living room watching a show when we heard the box slide. Almost as if a cat jumped into it. I look over and I actually see the box flaps move. But both our cats and our dog were in the living room with us. All windows and sliding doors were closed. So we all just kind of looked at each other like, what the fuck? Fourth and most recent time was about 7 months ago. I randomly woke up in the middle of the night and remembered I needed to charge my phone. It was 1:21 a.m. The outlet is right next to my side of the bed, so I just reached over and plugged it in while barely having my eyes open, then set my phone down. As I did that, I saw a shadow on the wall from my nightlight. It's about the size of a cat and it's coming towards me, so I just laid back in bed. I immediately remembered and looked at my feet. Both my cats were sound asleep on my bed. I tried really hard to fall asleep after that, but it took me almost an hour. I've had other uneventful occurrences, like leg rubs I feel, that I thought was my cat, but ended up being nothing. And something that sounded like a cat jumping off our couch into the wood floor when my animals were in my room with me. All my life, I've had experiences like these, and at this point, they're just expected. I grew up outside of a relatively small town in Texas, and more importantly, in a haunted house. Well, to be more accurate, on haunted land. I'd like to tell a few stories as well as my own experiences. Now, a little background which gives some context to why I say land instead of just house. My childhood home sat about 100 yards off the Colorado River, on about 100 acres of land technically owned by the city. It's a public city park that lays outside of the boundaries of the city. Anyway, my father is the live-in park ranger for this city. It's not a bad gig, all things considered. Though in my opinion, he could be paid more for being a maintenance and authority figure that's on call 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. This means if someone gets locked out, if a camping site loses power or has problems, or there's a conflict, someone's knocking at our door no matter the hour. It's always been this way since I was about 7 years old, and I'm now 29. He's a tough old man, almost 55 years old, and not all that inclined to share spooky stories of things he's seen and been told, though he does believe in ghosts. He'll try and find a rational explanation for why things happen, before he caves and admits it was a ghost. Now, I give this background because it's important to note that when things go wrong, he's usually the first person on the scene. This includes the time we had some jet skis explode while a father-daughter were riding them, alligators roll up on the campsite, personal disagreements, people trying to be sneaky and not pay by showing up after dark, people doing illegal substances or trying to get freaky in the back seat, in the rough camping part of the park, and of course, being right on the river, drownings. For some reason, people love to drink and swim, and someone drowns about every 3 years minimum. We're actually due for a drowning following the pattern. I don't hope people drown, but the memory of the last ones don't seem to stick as long as they should. Anyway, Dad is usually the first on the scene, either to try and help the people, or to direct the ambulance and police, and eventually search for the bodies. Most appear after a day. One took 3 days, and Mom said that's the only time she's seen Dad truly disturbed. It's not a fun part of the job, and Dad dreads summer and spring when people start coming out and acting stupid. So, people drown, sad as it is. That being said, these drownings have led to several spirits that hang around. Our most popular one to be reported is the first man my father helped try and find the body for. He was wearing a white shirt, blue jeans, and was a friendly man by nature. Now I need you to know, I've only seen him once myself after his passing. My mother and my father have seen both him multiple times, and many campers have seen him. One gentleman who likes to fish was out late. Close to midnight, returned to his car. Alone as he'd been all day. He gets his gear in, gets in himself, and goes to buckle up after starting his car. Only to see the smiling figure of a man in the white shirt and jeans in the passenger seat. He leapt out, and when he turned around, saw no one in his car. It's been almost 5 years, and this fisher no longer comes out by himself if he's staying after dark. Other campers have reported seeing a man sitting at a table, white shirt and jeans, who will see them and raise his hand as if to wave at them. People will wave back to realize no one is there. My mother used to work early morning shifts, 3 a.m. to 2 p.m., and she'd see him standing outside of the office on her way to work from time to time. My own experience with him is simple but spooky. I was sitting in the office with a friend one night talking, about 10:30. My parents now live above the office after Hurricane Harvey. Anyway, we were sitting there, and I saw out the window over my friend's shoulder a figure walking by the window, like it was going for a walk through the double glass doors of the office. Now I live in a park, meant for camping and visiting. However, it's important to note that the park was A, closed due to our sewer system getting redone, and B, it was the middle of the week, and most people didn't show up then. It was the man in the white shirt and jeans, and I knew that he was coming to buy something from the office. I was spooked, who wouldn't be? And my friend and I retreated upstairs rapidly. He's never been threatening, and I'm sort of glad the flood didn't take him away. However, even with him on the land, there are worse things that are here. My childhood home, which I must admit, I'm sort of still grieving and grateful I cannot live in again, was destroyed in Hurricane Harvey. It had 2 feet of water in it and emotionally devastated our family. There's something that still lives in that husk, now used for storage, and I hate it. Growing up, My bedroom was used during the day by myself and never at night. When I was little, I often had night terrors that had me shrieking for my mother and sleeping on the couch instead. She told me that I often said, "She has no face," when I asked why I was crying at night. By the time I was 9, the couch in the living room was my bed, and my bedroom held a cheap futon. The feeling of being watched, of something standing behind you, was and is overwhelming. I hated it. Even when I slept in the living room, I had to have the door to that room shut, as well as the one next to it. The feeling of being stared at was so strong. We had a door to the garage at one end of the living room, and one doorway to the kitchen. The garage door was open during the day, and there was no tangible doors to the kitchen. What I saw in these parts of the house, I can't say were human-like, but they at least wanted to be seen as it. They felt wrong, very wrong. Have you ever seen someone walk quickly by an open doorway? My mother and I saw these tall figures blur by, mostly dark, but occasionally pale. I hated seeing them. I always had this awful sense of dread and anxiety, a fear they'd not walk by the doorway, but walk into the room I was in. I think they did, more than once. I used to walk in circles in our living room while on the phone with my now platonic partner. As I'd walk by the couch, I'd feel as if something brushed against or wrapped around my ankle, and it always terrified me. I was always scared to look behind me or under the couch. As a grown woman of 20-something, I hated those things, those moments. They liked to touch my hair and ankles as I tried to sleep. And I'd say it might have been sleep paralysis, except it was only ever after I closed my eyes initially, and falling asleep was an hours-long trial. Mom often experienced seeing them and hates them too. Since Dad is on call 24/7, there are times he has to go out at night, much to our anxiety. We'd often hear the front door open and shut, or hear his voice, and call out to see what had happened or what was wrong. About half the time, he wasn't even home, and for a time, we'd write it off that we just heard things, until the dog started responding to it too. We used to have a lab mastiff mix, who would growl any time this happened and move closer to my mom like he was defending her. I've seen things dart under curtains or beneath sinks. Found drawers open and things knocked over and open that had screw-on tops or push-in tops that no one had touched in months. One time, a mounted deer head from my grandfather came off its hook and cracked me in the head. The nail it was on was unbent and undamaged, but it hurt, I assure you. Anyway, more recently, during my current visit home, Mom says that when she goes over to the house, or what used to be our house, she doesn't like going inside anymore. She says that when she takes the dogs out at night for bathroom breaks, she doesn't look in the dark windows, even if her instincts are telling her to. She's scared that if she does something, we'll be looking back at her, or feels like something is looking back at her when she does. I have these same feelings, and sometimes when I'm on doggy duty, the feeling that something is peeking over the 7-foot fence. Something opened the locked bathroom door the other night while I was visiting my parents, and an entire shelf popped off its rack in the cabinets a few weeks before that. Strange things still happen, but I'll be honest to say that I'm glad it's nothing like at the old home. These aren't the only moments I've had, which range from hearing muffled conversations for hours in the childhood home, in the dead of night, when everyone was asleep, to hearing it again at my friend's house for months and months. I've also experienced things at the high school where I teach, so I'm not sure if it's me or my life, but I'll never be persuaded the supernatural isn't real.